Hi, welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist show on Facebook Live. I'm Dan Barker, and I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, the other co-president of FFRF. And we have in studio with us today one of FFRF's very busy attorneys, Ryan Jane.
Our topic today is make up your mind. Do you have free will or don't you? And the reason Dan and Annie Laurie asked me to co-host today is because I was one of the readers and editors of Dan's new book, Free Will Explained: How Science and Philosophy Converge to Create a Beautiful Illusion.
And you're getting a sneak preview today. Dan's book, Free will be released in early February by Sterling Publishing. So today we're going to turn the tables, and instead of Dan being one of the interviewers, Dan, we're going to interview you about your new book and about a topic that has perplexed philosophers, scientists, theologians for more than 2,000 years.
If everything is determined by the material and mechanistic laws of nature, including our own thoughts and actions, can we say we are really free? Before we put Dan on the hot seat, let's listen to what the famous biologist and atheist Richard Dawkins says about this.
Most scientists today subscribe to a mechanistic view of the mind, where the way we are because our brains are wired up as they are, our hormones are the way they are. We'd be different, our characters would be different if our neuroanatomy and our physiological chemistry were different. But we scientists are inconsistent. If we were consistent, our response to a misbehaving person like a child murderer should be something like, this unit has a faulty component, it needs repairing. That's not what we say. What we say, and I include the most austerely mechanistic among us, which is probably me, what we say is, vile monster, prison is too good for you. In short, when we're thinking like academics, we regard people as elaborate and complicated machines like computers or cars. But when we revert to being human, we behave more like Basil Fawlty. We remember thrashed his car to teach it a lesson when it wouldn't start on gourmet night.
I'll count to three. 1, 2, 3, right. That's it. You've tried it on just once too often. Right. Well, don't say I haven't warned you. I've laid it on the line to you time and time again. Right. Well, this is it. I'm going to give you a damn good thrashing.
So that's the way I sometimes feel about my computer. The scientist Steven Pinker, FFRF's distinguished honorary president, called Dan's new book a lucid and unpretentious analysis of one of the most puzzling topics that the human mind has ever considered.
The foreword to Dan's new book was written by the famous skeptic and prolific author Michael Shermer, who wrote, Dan Barker has essentially eliminated the problem of free will and determinism. There is really nothing to resolve.
Well, that's quite a compliment, I guess. Nothing to resolve about free will. You've solved the problem, Dan?
Well, that's what Michael Shermer said, and he's the ultimate skeptic.
Yeah, and then let's see what some other people said. Robert Sapolsky said, a fascinating book, elegantly and playfully written and deeply challenging. And Matt Rothschild, who here in Madison used to be the editor of The Progressive, a wonderful, clear, and brilliant exposition of our ability to act morally without hiding behind nature or taking refuge in religion. So it seems like it's pretty free-ranging, but the topic is free will. And could you tell us, first of all, what is free will? What's the definition of free will versus determinism? And what prompted you to write your new book?
So Matt Rothschild is right. It has to do with religion as well, but it's a general philosophical paradox for many, many centuries, for millennia, actually. And most people, most philosophers, most scientists define free will, whether they think we have it or not. They define free will as the ability to do otherwise. You did this action, you chose a chocolate ice cream cone, but I could have chosen strawberry, and I felt free enough to do that. But actually, scientists are telling us that you actually are not free to choose to do otherwise. And there's all these experiments. Sam Harris talks about it in his book, Free Will. Experiments conducted that show that when you become conscious of a decision to choose chocolate or whatever, that decision was already made seconds before, and milliseconds and even many seconds before, so you're not really free.
Well,
So
what about if you just want to toss a coin, you close your eye and go like this? Isn't that free will?
well, that's what we call free will. And no matter what you think about free will, if you are one of the strict determinists who say, we don't have it, we don't have any free will, we're all machines, like that funny clip we just saw, even if you think that, you still feel like you have free will. Even the most strict determinist feels like they're free in their decisions. So and Dawkins was pointing to that in that clip that we saw. You know, as a mechanistic person, I know that it's all cause and effect. So the way that I think I've eliminated the problem is to say there shouldn't be a fight at all, because determinism and free will don't contradict each other. Whereas the debate has been, is it determined or do you have free will? And
Well, explain yourself, Dan.
all right, so if we take a two-dimensional approach, if somebody asks, does free will exist? I can say definitely, free will does not exist. But I can also say definitely, free will does exist, depending on which axis or which perspective you're using. So if you're using this horizontal perspective, through time there's cause and effect. Everything you've thought, all your brain, your parents had you, and then there's all these things coming in your life. If you use that horizontal two-dimensional approach, we are trapped. We can't rise above that and change the laws of nature. You can't go back in time and change any of that. We are all products of cause and effect, right? That's the horizontal approach. And why I called it harmonic free will is because with melody you have this horizontal line in time with music. But if you flip the perspective from horizontal to vertical and look at it this way, we have what we call harmony, notes that are stacked on top of each other. So as individual creatures, we are stuck in a deterministic universe. But as social animals, we are this way. And whenever you have a group of things, there are new properties that emerge. There's new qualities that emerge from a group that don't exist in the individual. Like a water molecule is not wet, but water is wet because the group adds something else to it.
So are you saying it's not a contradiction to say that both free will does exist and free will does not exist, even though that sounds like a contradiction? You're saying it's not because from you're looking at it from two different perspectives. So actually, it doesn't even make any sense to say that these two would be conflicting with each other.
Aren't you saying that free will is a beautiful illusion?
Well, yes, and that's where I agree with Sam Harris. It is an illusion. Sam Harris thinks it's an illusion we need to jettison, and I think it's an illusion we need to embrace. So everybody, even the strictest determinists, will say we have this illusion of free will, and I think it's like that extra dimension that's added in life. You know, a grain of sand is hard, but sand, the collection, sand is soft. So is it a contradiction to say sand is hard and sand is soft? That's not a contradiction because it depends what you're talking about. So the only thing that can contradict determinism is indeterminism. If free will is deterministic, then it doesn't contradict determinism. So you can have free will as a deterministic part of the universe, but you see the harmony of it when we become social creatures. And the only reason we care about free will is so that we're responsible for our actions. If somebody commits a crime, if somebody does something, we want to hold them morally accountable for what they did. Well, that is not an individual thing. That's a group social thing that's happening. It'd be like saying the heart exists. The heart is an organ, and it's pumping, and it produces, what it does is we call circulation. So it's no contradiction to say there's no such thing as circulation, right? The heart is the thing. What is circulation? It's not a thing, it's what it does. It's no contradiction to say there's no such thing as circulation, and yet there is circulation. You're talking at a different level, a different logical level. So I think we can say, at the horizontal level of the melody of our lives, there is no free will. Everything's determined. But at the vertical level, this harmonic level of the structure of our social lives, we see free will everywhere. And that's why it makes sense to say somebody is guilty of a crime. When somebody commits a crime, you don't say, well, it's not their fault because the laws of nature forced them to do it. So, you know what I mean? We make our moral judgments based on the assumption that people could have done otherwise, even though they couldn't have.
Although in many cases, people do take into account extenuating circumstances, and that's why we have different degrees of murder versus manslaughter, accidental death, etc.
Yeah, and that's what Sam Harris says in his book. You know, if you learn that the criminal actually had a brain tumor, you feel different about the person, don't you? Even though they committed the crime.
So isn't that a hole in your philosophy?
No, it's because it doesn't make the person less guilty. It makes the punishment different. So instead of sending them to prison, we put them in a mental hospital. We have to protect ourselves.
Maybe isn't the word less culpable? They're guilty, but they're not culpable.
Well, they did the act.
They're not responsible for their own acts. That's how the law looks at it.
And we have to ignore their defense if they're going to say, you know, I'm living in a day-to-day situation where I can't control what I do. It's all because of my past circumstances. I, as an individual, am living in a world that is deterministic. So how can you hold me culpable? I think we have to just say, well, we're not going to allow that in a court of law anyway, right?
Yeah, because that person committed the act, right? Regardless of whether there's free will or not, that person is the locus, their action, their behavior. And so society judges that behavior, and it's in that judgment that turns the sand from hard to soft. It turns it from determinism to a free will thing. We are judging the person, and Sam goes as far as to say that all of us are born with the neural equivalent of brain tumors because none of us can help what we do. You didn't pick your talents or your skills or your math abilities, or you didn't pick who you are. It just was handed to you.
But some people work a lot harder and they become better at math, or like you, they become a piano player instead of what I do.
Yeah, but even that was predetermined, my motivation to do that kind of stuff. So in my book, I try to say that there's no actual battle. There's supposedly these determinists and these free will, and there's different ways of talking about free will. The people who think that there's something above and beyond, like a soul or a spirit, something that violates nature, they're called libertarians. Not to be confused with the political party, but libertarian free will is like we can rise above nature and we can actually, you know, make things happen like a little god. We think we're little gods in our brains to change, you know, to change what normally would have happened.
So it's real liberty that determinists reject.
Yeah, it's that libertarian free will, although we have liberty within, and even Sam Harris in his deterministic book says, recognizing the illusion allows for greater creative control in your life. And I would like to ask Sam, what's the difference between creative control and free will? You have some control in your life as the locus of the person who's doing the acting. And it's when you judge that action that the question of free will comes into play.
Well, before this gets too deep and heavy, because this is not my actual, as you know, my favorite conversation, free will, I think people would be surprised to know that, Dan, your new book has a photograph of you that actually shows your toe.
My toe in the book.
And I guess we don't have a picture of that, but we can. You can get the book to get it. And the toe is in relation to your new best friend, a little chipmunk that you have tamed in our backyard. And can you, before we show the video of this chipmunk, do you want to say why did the chipmunk in this story make it into a book about free will? What's the relevance?
Well, actually, the chipmunk contributed because he dashed across the keyboard of my laptop. I was outside one day feeding him, and he jumped on the keyboard and he hit the hyphen, and that little hyphen stayed in the book. So he's a contributing author. But the question is, do animals have free will? Does every living thing, or is it just humans that are special, right?
And humans are animals, of course.
Of course, yes. So where do you draw the line? You know, if we human animals are special animals and we have some ability above and beyond. Of course, we have more complicated brains. But whenever you look in the eyes of any living creature, an animal or a pet or a bird.
Except for maybe a snake.
Well, even then you see something, right? You see something pretty amazing, something precious or cute, or you see an agency there. Yeah. And so
at some point, though, I think you have to draw the line where you have a point where it's like, I don't see that agency anymore. If you see, if you look at like an ant, right? An individual ant is just kind of doing what it's programmed to do.
Instinctive.
It doesn't, even though it has some behaviors that seem like you might describe as like, oh, it's as if it's thinking about this and contemplating and deciding I'm going to go this way, but it's not. There's nothing going on in the ant's head that's similar to what's happening in a human or a cat, dog, horse head, something like that.
But how do I know that about you then? I mean, how do I know? I mean, we have instincts, right? We're born with them. If something scares you, you instinctively move. We have reflexes. So where is that line drawn? And where is if there's such a thing as free will, and I don't think there is, there's not such a thing as free will. It's not an object. But whatever it is, where is that line drawn? And so...
Well, so how does the chipmunk come into this?
So when I watch this chipmunk, and I tell the story about how I became friends with this chipmunk, it's called Little One, I watched it making decisions. It was afraid, it wanted to take a risk, but it was afraid, and it was doing this, it wanted to come to the nut, and it didn't, and it looked like it was making a decision. And I conclude that actually it probably not. It's probably just total instinct, because animals need to eat, but they're trying to gauge their situation. But in my mind, it looked like that little animal is a free agent that's making some kind of a free choice. And so on the horizontal level of animals living in the natural world, I have to say that even we human beings fall into that realm of there's no free choice. There's no free will. It's all instinct. It's all nature. But when I look at that animal and I start judging it, something that's not in nature, something that's conceptual happens, and it's an emergent thing that happens. It's like we say, where is circulation? It's not a thing. It's a word we use to describe something that emerges. I look at that little animal and I see, even though that animal probably doesn't think it has free will, I see a small amount of some kind of volition in it.
Well, why don't we look at this little animal, this little chipmunk
And
that you've tamed? We have 2 videos, right?
That's one that you took.
I took these, yes.
I'm reading that book about free will right there, Alfred. Now look at this little guy.
You've tamed it.
It took a couple of years. He's going to come back again. By the way, I know it's a he now, so... So is that just a robot? Is that just a machine? What is that? It's a living creature that's making some kind of decisions. I don't think it or I have actual free will, but I think in the emergent sense, both of us do have some freedom in our lives where it counts.
Can we see the other video?
Annie Laurie took another one? Okay,
Yeah.
Let's see that. Watch it jump up on my knee. Here he comes. He knows where the food is. Watch this.
We turned the sound down, but you're calling it.
Come on. And it even lets me pet him. See that? And there's other chipmunks out there. As soon as he leaves, oh, here he comes back. All right.
So he hasn't convinced his whole family to come
Oh, yeah.
back?
Here comes another one. Now
Yep.
watch. There's,
This is another one. So now the whole family comes and
Well, it's
feeds
not a
in our
family.
backyard.
the chipmunks are not...
Oh, sorry about my thumb, or
the
whatever
chipmunks
that
are
is.
not social animals. They live solitary lives.
Well, you've
but some-
socialized it.
But some of them are... but they know the hierarchy. They know that little one is the big one. They know there's an alpha male.
You've confused them by naming him that.
Well, I suppose, yeah. Well, there's the other one, you didn't see it, has a little stripe on its side that's got kind of a deformed break in it. So it looks like a chromosome. And so I'm calling it gene. And since it's trying to horn in on little one's territory, I'm calling it selfish gene.
Nice.
Yeah, and you even had
Dawkins reference.
you had the satisfaction of being in the elevator with Richard Dawkins last summer and telling them that story.
There's a creature named Selfish Gene after your book. Yeah.
Well, I have a question. So you're talking about the observation of what looks like free will as an emergent trait, and I think something that might pop into a lot of religious people's minds or apologists, theologians' mind would be, what's the difference between an emergent trait and a transcendent trait? I've heard apologists before say that if you're a hard determinist, if you really believe in determinism, then there is no room for free will. Free will can only exist if there's some sort of transcendent world. And yet a lot of atheists will say that they believe in free will, and in a sense you're saying deterministically you don't, but there's an emergent free will that exists. So are you kind of walking down the path toward being committed to saying there is some sort of transcendent level of things?
Yeah, well, you can take the word transcendent different ways, and so you can get into equivocation. We could say, for example, and you're a musician, we could say that music theory transcends musical composition, right? You would say that logically. It transcends, not in the physical natural world. There's not some big thing with a capital M, music theory, hovering above us when we use that phrase. We can use the word transcendent in a perfectly natural way, that it logically transcends, or the government transcends the policy, or whatever. You can use all these examples. So emergent does not mean transcendent. Emergent is, like I said, with a water molecule or with a grain of sand. Where is the softness in the sand? Where is it? It doesn't exist anywhere unless you have a big quantity of it. And then you can use this emergent word that doesn't exist in the grain itself, right? So the word emergent is a perfectly natural term. And if those of us who are atheists, who do say we can embrace the illusion of free will, we talk about free will as an emergent, it's not really even a property, it's more of a quality. It's not an essence, it's not a thing. Then we are not making the mistake of transcending the natural world in some way. We're using logic at different levels. Well, there's a story about the chess game in there. And Ryan is the chess player in this office to beat. He's the strong player. And sometimes the attorneys are playing chess. And there's a story in there that you read about, like, what is a checkmate?
Yeah, and so I think the idea of it, right, was that there was a player who's on the verge of losing the chess game and is trying to think of some way out of it, and he says, wait a minute, there is no checkmate, right? I don't believe that the checkmate exists. Show it to me. And the person on the victorious side of the position says, well, look, your king is in check. He has nowhere to go. Based on the rules, this is the end of the game. That's checkmate right there. But the person sticks to his guns and says, nope, show me the material that is the checkmate. And of course, you can't do that, right?
Yeah, and so then the other player says, well, checkmate is a concept, it's part of the rules.
I think this is just a fancy way of being a bad loser.
Yeah, it is. It is, and the problem...
Not playing by the rules.
And there's no solution to that argument because it's that horizontal versus vertical. Mm-hmm. At the horizontal level, they're just pieces on a board, two players across a board playing each other like this. But the determinism free will debate is not two players equally across a board. A lot of philosophers call themselves compatibilists because they think determinism and free will are compatible. I say that they can't even be compatible or incompatible because you have to assume they're at the same level. It'd be like asking, is a banana compatible with forgiveness? It's a dumb question. So I call myself an a-compatibilist. So you're arguing about chess at this level when really it's a higher level that you're talking about. Checkmate is not a thing, right? But it's a concept, and you both play into the rules and you agree with that concept, so then you can play the game because you know what the concept is. So I think in a moral society, free will is not a thing. It doesn't exist, but it's a concept that we've all bought into. Another good example is marriage, for example. Annie Laurie and I are married. But marriage is not a thing. You can't go to the store and buy some marriage. You can buy a certificate. Marriage is an understanding in a social group of a certain agreement. People who live together without getting married may have lives that are a little different. So what is marriage? It's a social truth. And a lot of philosophers talk about the difference between a scientific truth, which would be horizontal, and a social truth, which is vertical. So social truths are things, in quotes, that don't actually exist, like money. Money is a social truth. So
currency physically exists.
Currency exists.
Yeah, but the value of money, if I give you a $1 bill and a $100 bill, it's just paper with green ink on it, right? Which one would you rather have? And it's not because there's any scientific truth to the value of the money. It's because society has emerged. There's an emergent truth that comes from social understanding. If a dog were to pick one of those two to eat, it wouldn't care, right? We care because we have this higher level understanding of what it means to have social truths. And I think free will is one of those social truths that don't exist in reality, but it's an agreement that we have in order to make moral judgments. So
let's get back to the issue of the atheist point of view versus the religious point of view in all of this, which obviously figured into your wanting to write a book. What is the typical, or what is the religious tendency, what is the proportion of religious people who believe in free will versus determinism?
So you don't have to be an expert to notice that the experts, the philosophers, the scientists, and the theologians all disagree with each other. There's no agreement among theologians. There's no agreement among Christians.
But don't a majority of Christians believe in free will?
Well, just like a majority of humans do. We feel, we have this illusion, this beautiful illusion. But Martin Luther, for example, he wrote a whole book called The Bondage of the Will. He said there is no free will. It's all predetermined. But Aquinas, on the other hand, said, yes, there is free will. The Quran says everything is determined in advance. The Bhagavad Gita says everything, we are just on a machine and the divine God directs it all. And the Bible even has contradictory ideas about free will. And some Christians like me, like I used to be, thought the idea of free will was important, because if you can't make a personal decision to accept Jesus as your Savior, then what did Jesus die for? You know what I mean? You have to have this free will choice. But the Calvinists think totally differently about that. Their whole idea of free will is different. So there's no agreement among believers. Get two Christians together and they're going to argue about free will, just like two atheists will.
Yeah, well, it seems like, I mean, religion, like we were talking about the criminal justice system before, religion typically has this really hard system of reward and punishment, and it's hard to imagine that making any sense or being something that a benevolent deity would do if it's in a world that is entirely predetermined. So it would seem to me, if I were religious, that I would be committed to find some way to defending the existence of free will, because otherwise you've just got this, you're hardwired to go to hell, and that just doesn't make any sense.
It's like Basil Fawlty hitting the car. That car really is deserving of the punishment. You did bad.
That is what the New Testament says. Straight is the path and narrow is the gate, and few there be who enter in. And it's all these people are predetermined to be damned according to these verses in the New Testament.
Yeah, but you can interpret the Bible different ways. Moses said, choose life. You should choose life so that you and your descendants can live. So it shows there
but Moses didn't even know Jesus. So according to many Christians, he was going to go here. So.
Yeah, well, write your own theology about that.
But what about many of the current books out there, though? I mean, Sam Harris is definitely anti-free will. Dawkins, correct?
Well, you saw Dawkins. Dawkins is conflicted. In fact, I asked Richard if he might write a blurb for this book, and he said, I'm not touching that. I don't know enough about it. And he said, you're very bold to go into those waters.
What about Daniel Dennett?
Daniel Dennett believes in free will. He's not a strict determinist, he's a strict compatibilist, I guess. He thinks we can use the word free will, and I quote him a lot. The only difference between me and Sam Harris is that I agree with Sam Harris almost 100%, that it's a strictly deterministic universe. Free will is an illusion, but he thinks it's an illusion we should get rid of because it's harmful. I think it's an illusion we should embrace because it's useful, and it gives us what we could call moral depth perception to be able to see moral actions in a way. And Jerry Coyne,
Of course, Jerry Coyne is a strict determinist.
And in fact, I quote Jerry Coyne, and he disagrees with me in this book. And Jerry and I have a friendly argument about this. And Jerry thinks that the criminal justice system has been infected with this idea of free will, which justifies capital punishment. And I agree with Jerry that capital punishment is a greater crime than the crime itself. And he thinks that if it weren't for free will, we wouldn't be doing capital punishment. And
well, but there are most Western countries don't have capital punishment, and I'm sure it's not based on this debate over free will. Wisconsin, our state, has not had capital punishment since, is it 1849 or 52? There was a horrible hanging in Milwaukee, and people in the state wanted no part of it, to their great credit. So, I mean, we can get rid of capital punishment without necessarily having to have a debate on free will,
and there's a lot of believers who are opposed to capital punishment. But Jerry thinks that this whole idea of retributive judgment that comes out of the Old Testament teachings and the biblical teachings. To some degree, he thinks that it has infected the criminal justice system. So we're going to get, in fact, in the 20th century America, an elephant was actually hanged for murder in Tennessee. So there's this idea in society that we need to, we need to kill, and instead of protecting society, that Jerry thinks that free will is part of the problem that has perverted our justice system. I think why not, why talk about free will? Why not just get rid of the problem of retributive justice? That's the problem. And get rid of the whole idea of trying to solve one crime with a larger crime.
Well, so anything else you want to say about your new book, Dan, before we take a few questions?
Michael Shermer, in the foreword to the book, Michael Shermer, of course, the great skeptic, he wrote this foreword, the good foreword, who's also strict determinist. He likes the book because it melds with kind of what he wrote in his book, The Moral Arc, about free will. It melds nicely with that. And he points out that most philosophers and philosophy students, about 60% of them would consider themselves compatibilists. It's only about, 12% that, you have the numbers there?
Yeah, 12% say we don't have free will.
12% say we do not have free will of philosophers.
So it's only 12% of philosophers. And then there's this philosopher named Eddie Namias, whom I quote in here, who does, I've never heard this phrase before, but he does experimental philosophy, which just means he surveys people about their philosophical views. About 2/3 of non-philosophers, when they're confronted with the reality that we live in a deterministic universe, about 2/3 of us say that's still no problem. We can still say we have free will. So that doesn't prove there's free will, but it does show that most human beings naturally feel like we are free agents. Our decisions are at least coming through us.
What did Bertrand Russell say about free will?
Yeah, well, Bertrand Russell, I quote him in there as well. He said very little about it, but he said that he makes this interesting point, that looking back through history, we can all see that there's no free will.
Mm-hmm.
But looking forward, and that's my point about consciousness, looking forward from this point in time, like Richard Feynman might call it a sum over histories of the light wave, or you might be a sum over future histories. Looking forward, he says we can still, because we are ignorant of the future, and we are ignorant of the future, you can therefore hypothesize is you can picture alternate futures. You can picture strawberry and chocolate. It may be predetermined which one you're going to pick, but you don't know.
I never know what kind of ice cream I'm going to pick. So this is where I have some quibbling.
Well, so you feel like you have free will.
I don't feel like I've made up my mind till the very end often.
Yeah.
Or they don't have my favorite flavor.
And
so.
it's rewarding, right? So this is another example of you saying that the idea, the illusion of free will is useful, because it wouldn't be very satisfying to go to the ice cream shop and say, well, I have no choice but to go with Rocky Road today, so bring it on, And instead it's like, oh, I really want this one, and it feels good to make that choice.
Or to go into the restaurant and say to the waiter, just give me what the universe dictates, instead of you feeling like you're part of it. So.
Well, also, maybe the special that you thought you were predetermined to have isn't available. It's sold out. Or they've run out of chocolate or whatever. I mean, what about these exigencies of life?
Because the idea of free will is that you could have done otherwise in the identical situation.
Right.
If the situation were exactly the same. But if any little thing's different about it, then that affects everything, and your choice might have been different. What if a bird flew by just before you ordered chocolate? Somebody ordered the last cone. Right, so then that changes the future.
What's the bird got to do with it?
Because you took too long to order.
Well, we were in Cornwall last summer, where on the coast of St. Ives. Yeah. Do you remember the seagulls?
They were up there watching for our ice cream?
They warned you to not hang around after you got your ice cream. I forget, there was a really good brand, homemade brand, because the seagulls were so aggressive.
And they were up on the roof there watching
They were known to go in and take away people's ice cream.
So they've learned that this is where the good ice cream is.
Well, just like my little chipmunk friend has kind of learned. And I have to say, there's these other chipmunks in the backyard, 3 or 4 of them. To me, and I know I'm just projecting and this is not right, but to me, they don't seem as free as my little friend seems. My little friend has acquired something, some anticipation or some latitude in life that gives it more options.
Well, he has more experience.
Yeah.
He's tamer.
So to me, at least, it feels like that one is more free. And we might feel that way about our pets, right?
I was going to say, do you think your feeling is being kind of distorted because you have this kind of pet relationship with it?
And it's ironic that we would feel that our captive animals are more free than wild animals.
But also, your pet knows you.
Yeah.
You've got a relationship with this chipmunk that it wouldn't have the same reaction likely with someone else. Although it's been very slow to take nuts from me.
Yeah.
Can probably smell that people or knows I'm not the same thing.
Because it sees,
it's
you know,
scared.
it's
It doesn't
scared
know what
of
I'm going
you.
to do. So there's a relationship there. So I don't know what that means
Well,
about
you
free
just
will.
need to spend more time
Right, out there in the hammock. But now I have another question. This is kind of a devil's advocate question. Do women care about free will? I mean, we've only talked about male authors, male philosophers. Did you encounter writings by women on this issue?
Yes, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, whom I quote in the book, who's married to Steven Pinker. And in her book, Plato at the Googleplex, she talks about this thing we were saying about emergent properties. Mm-hmm. She says, and I quote her in the book, saying that rivers on the planet, part of the planet's circulation system, you can't really find a river in the laws of physics. You can't find in the molecules what a river is. And so just because you can't see that, or Sean Carroll also talks about the rules of baseball. You won't find baseball in quantum physics or in the particles. So since we can't find it at that level, do we have to say baseball doesn't exist or rivers don't exist because we can't describe them in some perfectly deterministic quantum state? So she talks about different levels, and Bertrand Russell was famous about talking about logical levels. For example, in his famous debate with Father Copplestone in the 1940s, he attacked Copplestone for seeing design in nature by saying just because every human being has a mother doesn't mean that the human race has a mother. You're jumping up a logical level.
Eve.
It's a
What do you
category
mean?
mistake.
Yeah, it's a category mistake. So it's a category error. And that happens a lot. And a lot of believers, religious people, make that category error. Oh, you said this, therefore you mean this, when you're talking at a different level. And Rebecca's really, she's a famous philosopher.
Yes.
And so she's real good about
MacArthur
pointing out,
Fellow.
guarding against making these category mistakes in your thinking by making sure that you're limiting yourself to the proper levels. If you limit yourself to the horizontal level of cause and effect, she would say, and I think most of us would say, there's no such thing as free will. We have to say it doesn't exist, it's an illusion. But she would also say that looking at this emergent level, higher logical level, we can say it does exist at that conceptual level. Kind of like, another illustration I give was when you and I were hiking the shore of Lake Superior last summer. Remember that? The rocky coastline. And you were scampering along like a young teenager, just going up.
Oh, thank you.
And I hadn't put my glasses on yet. And I have monovision, and I have flat vision, and I have some
double vision.
strabismus. Yeah, double vision without glasses. Even right now, I see two of you. And so I was having trouble. I was like an old man, trying to get. And then I realized, I should put on my glasses, which corrects that. And then I felt younger. I felt more energetic. I was able to go around. Depth perception is an illusion. There's not two realities out there that give you depth perception. It's two different eyes that are seeing two different images that differ, and then your brain melds them and creates this illusion in the brain, which makes it easier to navigate. And so I think free will is a moral depth perception. The world is flat, but with free will, we can fool ourselves with this illusion, and we can actually navigate the world morally much more freely because we embrace the illusion as an important part of what it means to be a human. And I think we can say the same thing about free will. It is an illusion. It doesn't exist in the real world, but that illusion is something we should embrace and work with because it allows us to give leniency, and it allows for forgiveness. It allows for mercy. A strict determinist would make no distinction between any of those things. But with free will, you can say, I'm going to be more merciful, or I'm going to judge differently because of the context.
Or I'm going to try to do acts of random kindness today, whether you somehow we're determined to do that in advance or not.
Like feed a chipmunk.
Right.
So it's a very useful illusion. And I mean, I would think in music too, and you have a great long music analogy on here that you touched on before, but in playing music, we, and really I think it expands to other art too, we have to embrace something that goes beyond what we're physically doing, right? You're not going to make very good music if when you're playing piano, all you're doing is thinking, here are the notes, and here are my fingers, and I'm going to push these keys down, and then it's going to vibrate the strings. That's what's happening, but that's not a useful way to think about it. And the best musicians, I guarantee, none of them are thinking about the physical actions happening. They're thinking about the harmonic changes, the feelings of the particular song, maybe what motivated them to compose that particular piece, or what it might, all these different things going on that aren't the thing itself. It's this kind of, like you said, it's an emergent trait, right?
It's like the gestalt that happens, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There's this like above and beyond. It feels transcendent, and when you and I are playing music, we have this feeling, whoa, there's something. But music on a printed page, on the score, is just a two-dimensional shadow of a three-dimensional reality, right? And I think our daily deterministic lives are a two-dimensional shadow of a greater aliveness reality that we live in that doesn't transcend the natural world. It's a emergent thing that happens.
It's a collective trait, right?
Yeah.
So I think on that note, musical note, we may have exhausted the topic, but can we see if there's any questions that have come in?
Sure. Let's see. Okay, here's one. So Corey Melton asks, I'm still hung up on marriage is a social truth. So that's something you were saying earlier. I'm looking and can't find a definition of a social truth. Can you go into a little bit more of what you mean by what is a social truth?
Yeah, Jonathan Searle wrote a book, Mind, Language, and Society, and some philosophers talk about, I perform marriages because I'm an ordained clergy, and so I do a lot of secular marriages. And there comes a moment when I say some words into the air, I now pronounce you a married couple, or man and wife, or whatever. And by making that pronouncement before a group of witnesses, and marriage licenses have to be signed by witnesses, it had to happen in society. It had to be a social thing that happens. By speaking that phrase, you are now married, a social reality has been created that didn't exist before, and now society has this understanding, oh, they're married. Like a wedding ring.
It's also illegal. You're not wearing one.
Well, I was going to say
he doesn't like rings. I have my mother's. But it's also a legal truth.
Well, yeah, because this document gets filed in the county records with some ink on it, and becomes a legal truth. But it's only because we live in a society that has conventionally accepted marriage to be one of these social agreements that we have. So social truths are things that you really can't define at the subatomic level. They're things that we agree with, like money and with other. Another example would be a verdict in a court of law. The whole trial is over, the jury comes out and they pronounce this verdict, and the verdict that they pronounce might actually not be true, but it's a legal truth. A verdict doesn't mean you're speaking the truth. A verdict means it's true by virtue of being spoken as a truth. Yep. Verdict means to speak the truth.
Well, are all social truths also legal truths? I mean, aren't there other kinds of social truths that have nothing to do with the law?
Yeah, like money. I mean, there's all sorts of...
There's a lot of law about money, Dan.
Well, okay, there's a lot about money, but...
It's currency that's issued by the government.
But its very existence, we all agree on the value of it. So even if we were in a society that didn't have a legal system and we were bartering and came up with currency, we might agree, that, okay, I don't have chickens to trade for your wood, but I have this valuable piece of gold, right? And it's pretty, and you can take this, and anyone else is going to like it, so it has this understood value. So it's the society collectively saying, we're going to put a value on this, right? That's not inherent in the thing itself. Yeah. And I think within the legal world too, it's it's full of legal fantasy. That's practically my entire career, is based on navigating how legal documents have been interpreted by courts. They come up with rules and tests, and we as attorneys have agreed that we're going to basically play this game, even though it can get far removed from what's really going on. And it's just that's the system that we've all agreed upon.
Our president is the president because of a social truth. There's nothing different about a human being who is a president or a senator.
Tell that to Trump.
Wow. Well, he's very stable.
He thinks that none of the rules apply to him.
So these are social conventions, and I think free will is one of those social conventions, one of those social truths that we buy into that in the long run disappears. It's kind of like, and I use the example in the book about imaginary numbers. The imaginary number I, is an impossibility. It doesn't exist. The square root of a negative number can't exist. But you can use I in an equation as long as it cancels out, as long as I over I becomes 1. You can use it, but when the equation is done, that I disappears. So I think in our moral calculations, free will is a necessary component of making that formula work. But in the long run, in the cosmos, there is no such thing as free will. It's not really there, but we need it to do our calculations.
Mm-hmm. So free will is kind of an imaginary tool, similar to imaginary numbers in math.
In a sense, it's an analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And the book is full of analogies, and I make a point of saying you shouldn't argue by analogy, but you can illustrate by analogy. All these analogies help you to picture what it might be like.
Right.
Now, if there's somebody else who's had a question and they're dying or a comment.
So there's one more question, which is an important one to hit. So Casey asked via email, hi Dan, looking forward to your new book. Where can I buy it?
Oh.
Well, FFRF has ordered copies, and
at our website you can get advance copies that will have something up later today. We probably have them shipments in a week.
the only way to get a signed copy is through FFRF.
That's right.
Of course, you can get it through all the other. Sterling Publishing is owned by Barnes & Noble, so Barnes & Noble will have it in their stores. And it's a Kindle version as well, but FFRF is buying copies so you can have a signed copy.
And you are donating your royalties for the FFRF books that
I have
we sell.
no choice. I have no free will but to do that.
That's
So there's
very
no
nice.
conflict of interest, right?
Right.
So any book you buy through FFRF, the royalties go back to FFRF.
Helps FFRF, and you're going to get an autographed copy. So I may not be up this second on our shop, but it will be by the end of today.
And when is it going to be available again?
Well, the release date is February 6th.
Okay.
And in Madison, there will be a launch party at Room of One's Own bookstore.
Feminist bookstore.
A feminist bookstore
And
on
then
February 9th.
And then I think it's going to be Tuesday, February 13th. We'll sort of celebrate Valentine's Day and Dan's book release at Free Thought Hall.
For members.
For members. People who are members of FFRF in the Madison area will be getting an invite soon on that. And we do always like to celebrate Valentine's Day, even though we have no religious component to it, of course. Just sugar cookies, chocolate.
And we'll have some music, and well, maybe Ryan will play a song or two.
I would love
Ryan
to.
is a wonderful classical pianist.
I was going to ask too, and stand up for classical music a little bit, because you were talking about how, you touched earlier on how there's the two-dimensional melodies and then there's the emergent third dimension of harmonies, and you're saying that composers, arrangers, and jazz soloists have to think in that emergent third dimension. But I wanted to say, and I think you would agree that good classical players anyway, and I'm not always putting myself in that category, I think they do the same thing, don't you? That to make good music, you have to be thinking about, especially if you're a pianist, you have to be thinking about this in that same way.
We're interviewing a classical pianist, right after this show for Free Thought Radio.
His name is Jared Dunn. He's a free thinker, and he agrees. And if you watch somebody like Jared or like you play, you'll see that it's not just mechanical, push this button like you're typing something. It's like music is greater than the sum of these notes. It's something that breathes and lives, and you can wait a little bit extra, you can play the song, and you can make it a living thing rather than just some notes on a page.
Yeah. But as a jazz soloist, you have this added improvisational element, which really gives you this, you're making the most out of this free will illusion, right? Where you're trying to get rid of all the confinement and saying, the sky's the limit, you know, whereas when I sit down and play a Beethoven sonata, I'm not going to be, I could, but I'm not going to be changing the notes and saying, let's try an A minor here and see how that sounds.
Yeah, but even in jazz, there's parameters. You have the structure of the song, you have the chords, and you can try to bend them as much as possible. But you're still working within a structure itself. So it's like right now, that sentence that you just spoke to me, you just made it up, right?
I did.
Did you memorize it? Did you quote it from something?
Was it predetermined?
Well, it was predetermined,
yes.
but you improvised it on the fly. Nobody told you what you have to say next. We all do that in language. And music is a language like that. And jazz musicians treat music in the same way. We don't want to know what's coming next. In fact, we prefer not to know so that it can surprise even us when we're playing. So
it's like when you're reading a novel, right? You could read the last few pages first. It's not going to change, and you're holding it the whole time. But we want to go through the experience of not knowing.
yeah.
Well, I think that we have thoroughly discussed the whole topic, don't you? Free will, at least it's a good
actually,
teaser.
no, there's a lot more in the book.
A good teaser for the book. What's the name of the book again, Dan?
Free Will Explained: How Science and Philosophy Converge to Create a Beautiful Illusion.
And you wanted to call it what?
Well, I wanted to call it Make Up Your Mind at first, which I think is a better title. And even the editor agreed with me that Make Up Your Mind is a better title. But the publisher wanted the title to explain the book, because Make Up Your Mind could be about
Understandably,
anything.
I guess.
So yeah, so I guess I had no choice but to go along with the.
And I have no choice but to thank you, Dan and Ryan, and those of you who are listening and watching later for joining us on FFRF's Ask an Atheist today. And we'll be back next week, Wednesdays at noon Central Time. And even though most people here seem to believe in determinism, I don't know what that show's going to be about. So we'll be as surprised as you are when we pick a topic. If you have a suggestion, please let us know on Facebook. And thanks for listening, watching.